Hello all, my name is John Andrews, and tonight I'm going to be giving you guys a presentation on how Christianity played a role in the leadership and the life of Confederate leaders. Behind me is a whiteboard that I've got the two gentlemen I'm going to be talking about tonight, John S. Mosby and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and just some of the talking points I'm going to be hitting on tonight, so if you guys want to follow along. But it's just there for your use. I've also posted an abstract and a short source list at the front of this for your review, so I hope you guys enjoy this post, and with that, we'll get started. So the American Civil War was one of our nation's bloodiest and most brutal wars that was fought here on American soil. It lasted from 1861 to 1865 and touched virtually everyone in America in some way or another. Throughout this epic and deadly conflict, leaders for both the Union and Confederacy rose to the challenge and performed superbly throughout the war. One of the main driving factors of the Civil War, as we all know from class and general history, was the issue of slavery. Another factor that has been touched on in this class, but often overlooked by mainstream society, is the fact of religion and the role that it played on either side of the conflict. So today we're going to focus on two individuals who were leaders in the Confederate Army that I found their stories interesting and compelling. And those men, like I just previously mentioned, were Thomas Stonewall Jackson and Thomas Jackson, who is more commonly known by his nickname as Stonewall, which he got after the First Battle of Manassas, and then Colonel John Singleton Mosby, otherwise known as the Gray Ghost, for his raiding techniques and procedures during the war. So these two men were highly successful combat leaders. I'm sure everybody has heard of at least one, if not both, of these men. And they were both respected and feared by the Federal or Union troops they came in contact with. While at the same time, they were both loved by their men and highly respected and commended by their superior officers. Both were dedicated to the cause, the Southern cause, and to their beliefs. Yet their personal beliefs and why they began fighting the war were different, and there are also different viewpoints on how they view God. So within this discussion, I'm going to focus on three major themes that I think encompass both men's viewpoints on religion and how Christianity or Christian beliefs shape their conduct in the war. These three themes are slavery, their upbringing or beliefs, and how God or Christian values put their influence on them while they're conducting military or combat operations. My focus here is to understand how these two men who fought admirably on the same side of the conflict had different viewpoints in why they were fighting or their personal belief systems, just a complexity of the Confederacy itself. So to begin with, we're going to look at the upbringing of both men, and I'm going to start with Stonewall Jackson. Jackson grew up in a Christian household in Virginia. His mother was very religious and imparted her knowledge on Thomas at a young age. Unfortunately, his father died when he was very young, and then his mother died when he was only 6 years old, leaving himself and his brother and sister to be orphans. Originally, the kids kind of got split up, and he ended up living with his uncle, who was one of the largest slave owners in the district. And then while his upbringing here wasn't necessarily Christian, he took it upon himself to teach slaves to read at a very young age. He was still in his teens, and which was actually forbidden by law, by Virginia law at that time. And just kind of spoke of his character and what kind of person he was going to be. He later went on to attend the West Point University, or not University of West Point, but West Point on the Hudson River, United States Military Academy. He was accepted there in 1842, and he struggled academically at first because of his rural upbringing, But by the time he graduated in 1846, he ranked number 17 in his class of 59 cadets. He was a devout Christian. He practiced as a Presbyterian, and he organized and taught Sunday school classes in the 1840s and 1850s for African Americans at his church before the war started. In a conversation he had with his wife, he stated that he said that he preferred that my labors should be given to the colored children, believing this was more important and useful to put the strong hand of the gospel under the ignorant African race to lift them up. He treated all the African Americans he came in contact with, whether slave or free, as friends and as people. He showed them extreme kindness throughout the war, throughout the tenure of his life, and that even carried over to his own slaves, because he did own slaves. However, he treated them with a very, very gentle hand and was very passionate about their education and their welfare of life. His religious beliefs were a great influence on his military obligations as well. The historian G.F.R. Henderson said this about Jackson: that Jackson's religion entered into every action of his life. No duty, however trivial, was begun without asking a blessing or ended without returning thanks. So this fervor carried into his military life. Every day he woke up, he had a prayer. And though he was a good tactician and utterly fearless in combat, after every victory, as soon as the chance presented itself, he ordered all of his regimental chaplains to hold services and give thanks and praise, one for the soldiers themselves for performing God's will for the Confederate cause, and to thank God for protecting his forces in their service to preserving the South. He was also a very modern thinker when it came to religion. Although he was a Presbyterian, as I mentioned before, he was not of the belief that any one particular church was more correct than another in its beliefs. And what I found most interesting about him was his humility. He never took lead in any religious services or had any sort of special spot when the services were ongoing. Instead, he decided to sit in the back with all the privates. And the only thing he really did was kind of beckon guys to come sit next to him that were too intimidated because he was the general officer. It was without question that Jackson was a very religious and devout Christian, and his faith led him to support the Confederate cause while still being generous to his slaves and giving praise to God in all things. So now we're going to transition over to John Singletary Mosby. He was raised in a slaveholding home in Virginia as well, where he was a member of the plantation class that owned several slaves. He even owned one slave during the war, which he allowed to go free and settle in New York. His personal beliefs led him to oppose both slavery and secession, and the only real reason that he volunteered to join the Confederate cause is because of his dedication to Virginia and his family. He would later speak out in public against the lost cause, and many Southerners used to make the war look as if the Southern cause seemed as if it was not about slavery. Mosby said in the following, in letters after the war, he said, "I am not ashamed of having fought on the side of slavery. A soldier fights for his country, right or wrong. He is not responsible for the political merits of the cause he fights in. The South was my country." He also wrote that, "While I think as badly of slavery as Horace Greeley did, I am not ashamed that my family were slaveholders. It was our inheritance. Neither am I ashamed that my ancestors were pirates and cattle thieves." And then one of the most prolific things I found that he said is that people must be judged by the standard of their own age. So this speaks highly of his character and just kind of who he was. He wasn't scared of what he had been or what he'd done in the past. However, he was not a fan of slavery, which I'll touch on here in a minute. Mosby could best be described as a Methodist in his upbringing, and then more of an agnostic in his adult life. He made challenging comments about religion and the teaching and practices, and he also even claimed in a letter to one of his friends, Joe Bryan, that he was not a Christian. However, despite his personal walk with God, or what he claimed, he also he supported the Catholic faith, which his wife was a devout member of, and he supported his children's education in the Catholic faith. and within the Catholic Church as well. He also had a battalion. He employed a battalion chaplain in his Ranger unit, which is a provisional unit, not a part of the actual. It was part of the Confederacy, but it was not an active military group. The men could come and go as they please, as it was a volunteer-only organization. His chaplain was a Universalist who drank heavily, played a lot of cards, generally lived a life that was not exactly what you'd expect of a chaplain. But Mosby ensured that he did have a chaplain on hand as a religious entity in case any of his soldiers, had any issues, or to lead them in prayers and kind of keep them on the right path. During battle, Mosby did not have the same religious appeal or trust that Jackson did of God, as it seemed from everything I read. However, he was a brilliant Ranger leader whose raids were of renown throughout the North and South. He did display some Christian principles within his military feats, mainly in dealing with prisoners in 1864. During the conflict, he and his men gained a reputation, and the Northern soldiers that came in contact with him there in 1864 captured some of his men and then subsequently executed them for being Rangers. They caught them out of uniform, which was protocol for the Ranger units in those days, considered them spies and executed them. So Mosby executed 7 Union soldiers on the backside. Shortly following that, though, he wrote to General Phil Sheridan, who was the Union commander for all forces in the Shenandoah Valley at that time, and asked that both sides treat their prisoners humanely, basing this fact on that Mosby had captured more Union soldiers and released more Union soldiers than his men had been captured up to that point in time in the war. So Sheridan agreed to this, and after that, there was no more execution of prisoners of war. Also interesting to note here is that even though Mosby was not in agreement with going to war in the first place, he didn't believe in slavery, or that the South or Virginia should succeed. He was one of the last soldiers or last leaders of the Confederate Army to surrender. He didn't surrender until June of 1865, which is a full 2 months after the war officially ended. It just kind of shows his dedication to duty and what his personal beliefs were towards his military service. Both these men show excellent examples of how the Christian faith influenced their Christian faith or Christian values influenced the way they conducted the war. We find it's very successful cases with both men militarily who achieved great victories for the South, and their personal courage and beliefs would carry them throughout the tenure of the war, whether at 1863 for Jackson or all the way through to post-war for Mosby. They had similar views of slavery, although Jackson never really particularly did anything other than he didn't speak out against slavery. He assisted the slaves. He was encouraged their welfare and well-being and ability to read. Mosby, even though he did own a slave during the war, sent him up to New York, as I said earlier, and he was paid the man during the tenure of the war, and then whenever emancipation happened, he was released. And then he was just a staunch believer in the fact that there should not be any slaves in the South or anywhere else. They both approached Christianity from vastly different apertures, but yet strove for humanity amidst this bloody and violent conflict. And then, so the thing that encompasses both these men and why I picked them is that even though they were both on the same side of the conflict in the Civil War, their Christian beliefs and their personal beliefs drove them to fight for different reasons. And I just thought that was an interesting topic. Hope everybody enjoyed this presentation. I know I went a little longer than 10 minutes, but there was a lot of information here. I thought it was pretty important. I did my best as a Christian historian during this to keep myself grounded in objectivity and honesty in accordance with our course guidelines. And I hope everybody enjoyed this presentation And I look forward to all comments, feedback, and watching everybody else's posts here in the near future. Thank you.